Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your time and for joining me here today. I'm Michèle Thompson, the photographer behind Magpie'n'Moo Photography. I'm very excited to be here today to be able to share some of my work, share some tips, and hopefully inspire you along the way. We're going to be talking about a technique that I absolutely love to do and do often, and that's long exposure photography. I love it because of all the creative possibilities that it has to offer. And once you know the basics, it's not that hard to do. I'm going to be walking you through that process step by step in the session tonight. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen now. My presentation is titled Long Exposure Made Simple, Create Photos That Speak. Now you might be wondering, what does that actually mean? So let me start with a question. Have you ever seen a photo that made you stop in your tracks? Maybe it made you feel instant calm, or it looked dreamy or magical, or it just had something extra that drew you in. That is the magic of long exposure photography. It stretches time, captures movement, and evokes emotion. So in this session, I'm going to show you how I use motion, stillness, and light to create images that not only look beautiful, but feel meaningful as well. So after a brief intro, this is what we're going to be covering. I'm going to go over a non-technical overview of what long exposure photography is and how it can take a photo from good to wow. I'll talk about when and where this technique really shines and go over a step-by-step breakdown of how I shoot long exposures in the field. I'm going to be sharing some practical, easy-to-apply tips to help you get started, as well as a sneak peek at what we'll be doing at the upcoming hands-on workshop that follows this webinar. If you're not able to join us for the workshop, no worries. I believe the session will still give enough of an overview of my process, which you can follow or adapt as you begin your own long exposure journey. We will end the session with going over 3 common problems I face when shooting long exposures and how best to overcome them if it should happen to you. So let's dive in. For those who don't know me yet, I'm Michèle Thompson from Magpie'n'Moo Photography. I would call myself primarily a landscape photographer, though I shoot across various genres. I am a moon chaser, a sun chaser. I shoot cityscapes. They're great moments for long exposures in cityscapes. I love to travel, hence travel photography is part of my portfolio. And I shoot street photography. There are opportunities for long exposures there as well, which you will see later in my presentation. I've been fortunate to have my work published, including in Trope, New York City, which is the 5th in the Trope City series, following Chicago, London, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and now New York City. These books are available across bookstores across the United States, as well as on Amazon. I'm also a Case Filters Canada Pro partner and work as a Case global reviewer and introducer of the products. So if you have any questions later about Case products, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share my experiences and to answer any of your questions. And if I don't know the answers, I will get the answers for you. But enough about me. Let's get started with the reason why you are all here. Since we're talking about the art of long exposure, I thought we should start at the beginning with what is long exposure photography? Well, at its core, a camera works like a window with a curtain. When you press the shutter button, the curtain opens, light enters through the lens and hits a sensor to create an image. The amount of light and how long the shutter stays open determines the final result. In everyday photography, this happens in a fraction of a second. With long exposure, you're just keeping that curtain open for longer, capturing motion over sub-seconds or even minutes. And this allows you to control motion in a way that the human eyes can't see. The longer the shutter is open, the more movement you capture. Makes sense. And as I mentioned before, long exposures can range from fractions of a second to several minutes, depending on the effect that you want. For me, I consider anything longer than 1/15th of a second to be a long exposure. Most are done using a tripod to keep the camera perfectly steady. And if you don't have a tripod, maybe you're hiking or walking around a busy city and you don't want to lug a heavy tripod around, I've used in a pinch mailboxes, garbage cans, fence railings, rocks, and even the ground, anything to keep my camera still. That being said, there are some long exposures that can be taken handheld, as you will soon see in my presentation. So why take long exposures? Well, I use long exposure photography to convey emotion, like the feeling of calm, energy, drama. I take long exposures to tell a story and ultimately to create art. And that's what tonight is about, using long exposures to craft emotion-driven, story-rich, visually compelling images. And it's easier than you think. But before I walk you through how to take images like this, let's look at some real-world examples. This will give you a clear idea of the kinds of results that you too can achieve using this technique, as well as giving you an idea of when this technique really shines. The effect on water. One of the most common and powerful uses of long exposure is for bodies of water. Here you're seeing two photos taken from the exact same location. This is the gap at Humber Bay Park West. The one on the left was shot at 1/25th of a second. There's texture in the water and the clouds in the sky. Now compare it to the one on the right, which is a 102-second exposure. That's 102 seconds of motion being recorded. Motion of the water and the clouds in the sky. Notice how this 102 seconds smoothed out the water and stretched out the clouds. To me, the smoothness creates a much calmer, more serene feel, and that's how I felt while watching that sunrise. The left image captures the moment, whereas the right captures how I felt being in that moment. Now, if you see an asterisk beside any of the settings on the screen, it means that a neutral density filter was used. And this is something we're going to be talking about shortly. Neutral density filters is a key tool for many of the effects that you'll be seeing tonight. Here's another example with water, but this time from the rugged coastline of Kauai. Again, the photo on the left was shot with 1/25th of a second. And while it's a nice image with wave action and sky detail, look at the difference on the right, which is shot with a 59-second exposure. The longer shutter speed smoothed the ocean, giving it a silky look. The clouds are also stretched, adding to the dreamy feel of the scene. The left image captures the moment. The right captures how I felt in that moment. The calm as I stood by the water watching the sunrise. With waves, you can also shoot a shorter, longer exposure to get wave trails. And this is something I love to do. So this was early morning from the coast of Tenerife. By using a shutter speed of 1/3 of a second, I was able to capture some slight motion of the water, resulting in these silky wave trails, which can lead the eye into the frame, as seen here. Personally, I love this look, and I will go over how to do that later if you too are interested in achieving wave trails in your photography. Long exposure is also fantastic for waterfalls. This is Skoga Falls in Iceland. It's 197 feet tall, 82 feet wide. As a bit of trivia, Game of Thrones fans may recognize this. It's the waterfall behind which Jon Snow and Daenerys landed while riding dragons. Start by looking at the left photo. This is a 1/100th of a second exposure. I have included the couple in yellow to give some scale. As you can see, this waterfall is massive. The image on the right is the 8-second long exposure. And notice how that 8-second smoothed out the water, so it almost looked like milk. Now, while I did use a long exposure for the image on the right, it's actually not my preferred one. Why do I say that? Because I want to remember that raw power of that 197-foot waterfall, the thunderous roar of that water falling 197 feet, and the cold mist in the air. And this photo here seems to convey that better than the long exposure one. So the moral of the story is, in the art of long exposure, sometimes not doing a long exposure can also be the right choice to preserve the feeling of the moment. In contrast, this is a situation when it was the right moment. This is Horseshoe Falls at Niagara Falls, Ontario, and this is a 13-second exposure. Here, it too was very loud. I believe Horseshoe Falls is almost as tall as Skoga Falls, but much, much wider. It was freezing cold and the mist was intense. But here I made the compositional decision to create some contrast between the rough texture of the ice-covered branches with the smooth flow of the water and the soft sky. And this is where long exposure helped me balance that. Long exposure isn't just for water. It works beautifully with clouds as well. In the cityscape on the right, I used a long exposure to smooth out the water and streak the clouds, giving the city a dreamlike, almost futuristic feel. It looks as if the clouds are radiating out from the CN Tower. The left image, we're at a beach on Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. I arrived for sunrise with no sun in sight. Not an uncommon occurrence if you're chasing sunrises. But then I saw someone placing these bright orange umbrellas on the sand. That visual contrast of the bright orange umbrellas against the pale white sand and the light blue cloud-ridden sky caught my eye. I chose to do a long exposure to help smooth the busy sky, putting focus on the bold horizontal lines of the umbrella. Same technique used here before the two images. Same technique, but two very different results. One feels calm, the other feels more dynamic and full of motion. Long exposures is not just for nature. It works beautifully in cityscapes. Here I used a 2-second exposure to capture a passing streetcar on Queen Street East. That brief 2-second moment resulted in a streak of light, to me conveying movement, energy, and making the scene feel alive. For me, when I see streaks like this, I can practically hear the vehicle, in this case, the streetcar, just whizzing by me. Another cool effect you can achieve are light trails by capturing moving headlights and taillights in long exposures. You can turn a busy street into a colorful, vibrant scene. Because the cars are moving during the exposure, they don't appear solid. They disappear, leaving just the trails behind. So let's talk about a few examples here. This left image was taken in Old Quebec City, the province of Quebec, Canada. I had envisioned the shot, scouted the location, then returned at night to shoot it. I wanted an image with the older Chateau Frontenac, now known as the Fairmont Frontenac, sitting high above, lit up at night with colorful lights, to be balanced by what I knew would be colorful modern light trails below. I love this image because it seems to be telling the story of a city which dates back to 1609, evolving over time. It's a contrast of the old with the new, the traditional with the modern. This top right image is a long exposure of Lower Manhattan and the Hudson River taken from New Jersey. The streaks here are the ferries crossing back and forth between the two states. The bottom right is shot near the airport at sunrise. We were waiting for the sun to align with the CN Tower. While waiting, I used a 2-second exposure to capture some cars moving by. The red taillights adds a nice balance to the warm tones of the sky. I actually waited for more cars to go in this direction so that I could have more red taillights to balance the orangey-red sky above. 6, street scenes. Long exposures can bring street photography to life, and I love using this technique for street scenes, as this is one instance where a tripod is not necessary. It's usually taken handheld between 1/13 to 1/4 of a second. It allows just enough movement to hint at motion while still keeping key details sharp. So instead of a static scene which freezes a moment, the little bit of motion adds some life and tells a story. This left image here is of the famous Audrey Hepburn mural in New York City's Little Italy. I waited across the street for someone to walk by the mural and chose this person because his outfit seemed to echo the mural's colors very well. On the right, this image was taken during a T-dot photo walk on Wellington Street East. I needed something for the foreground, that's the bottom third of the photo, to complete the image. So I waited on the sidewalk across the street for the right car to pass by. And by right, I mean the right color that hopefully matched the background colors that we see here. So when this orange and green Beck taxi drove by, I immediately took the shot. The car's colors works beautifully with the colors in the building in the background. Lastly, another creative way to use long exposure is called intentional camera movement, or ICM. In ICM, you're intentionally moving the camera while taking a photo, usually during a shorter, longer exposure time, like maybe 1/15 to 1 second. This movement creates soft, abstract, and artistic effects, almost like a painting, as you can see in these examples of the ones I took of waves along the shore. The key to ICM is experimenting. How you move the camera, your shutter speed, in which direction, and how fast will all affect the final photo. And that's what I love about ICM. We can all be shooting the same wave, the same time, and all come out with different images. It really is a whole lot of fun. Here are some other ICM images, this time of trees. These, I feel, have a very peaceful, dreamy effect, almost like a watercolor painting. And here's a long exposure ICM of the Toronto skyline, which I took from Humber Bay Park West. And this is something we can try at the workshop this weekend. This is a 1/2 second vertical pan, meaning that I took the shot as I was moving vertically. So far, you've seen the various creative possibilities of long exposure. For example, in ICM, in water, clouds and cityscapes, clouds and cityscapes, street scenes, light trails. So now the natural next question is, how do you do it? How do I shoot a long exposure? What gear do I need? I've already given hints throughout the presentation, but first and foremost, I want to say the best gear is what you already have. Please don't let yourself be deterred by thinking you don't have the right gear to do long exposure photography. Even your phone camera can take long exposures, though it may be limited in duration. However, there are applications out there. For example, Pro Camera is a paid app. I think it's $30 that offers manual controls and other features that can turn a phone camera into a camera. I haven't used it personally, but I've seen how it works and it looks pretty cool. That said, if you want more flexibility and more creative control, this is the gear that I would recommend. Ideally, you want a camera that has a manual mode, often marked with an M. This lets you control 3 important camera settings: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Being able to adjust these 3 settings gives you full control over the amount of light you need and hence how your photo turns out. You want the perfect amount of light to properly expose your image. If it's too much light, it would be too bright and it can appear completely white. If there's not enough light, the image will be too dark. Now, for those of you who may be new to these photography terms, think of it as trying to get the perfect tan under an umbrella that has a little opening. Using that analogy, aperture is like the size of the opening in the umbrella where the light is coming through onto your skin. If it's a larger opening, it just lets in more sunlight at once. If it's a smaller opening, there's less light coming in. Shutter speed in this analogy is like how long you stay in the sun. The longer you're exposed in the sunlight, the more sun hits your skin. The shorter you're out, the less sunlight hits your skin. ISO is like how sensitive your skin is to sunlight. High ISO is like sensitive skin that needs less sunlight to show results, whereas low ISO is like more resistant skin, which needs more exposure to light for the same effect. How you vary each one will determine how you get the perfect tan. And that's how aperture, shutter speed, and ISO work to get the perfect amount of light to properly expose your image. Your camera should also have something called a time or bulb mode. This works with manual mode, which is and lets you take photos longer than the 30 seconds, which is the usual limit on most cameras. Watch in this video. This is my camera and the shutter speed shown here, how it goes up to 30 seconds and then switches to time and bulb mode. I prefer to use time mode. It's like a stopwatch. You press it to start and you press it to stop. Bulb mode is when you hold down the shutter and let go when you want it to stop. You should also have a lens with manual focus. This is really helpful, especially in low light. For example, at sunrise or sunset, when your camera's autofocus might have trouble finding focus. How the autofocus mode on the cameras work is by looking for areas of high contrast between light and dark. When there is very little light, there's little contrast, hence why the autofocus doesn't work very well. So by switching to manual focus, you avoid that problem and have more control over making your photo sharp. With long exposure photography, you're often keeping the shutter open for several seconds or even minutes. That is way too long to hold your camera steady by hand. So that's why using a sturdy tripod is a must. It keeps your camera still and prevents blurry photos caused by tiny movements. A remote shutter lets you take a photo without physically touching your camera, which helps avoid camera shake and unintentional blur. It's especially useful for long exposures over 30 seconds. As I just mentioned, most cameras can't go past 30 seconds on their own, so you'll need to switch to bulb or time mode. The remote helps you control how long that shutter stays open, down to the exact second when using bulb or time mode. This is my remote. I insert this end of the camera, and this is the button that I press to open and close the shutter. So for most low light exposure shots, you only need these four main tools: camera with a manual mode, lens with manual focus, a tripod, and a remote shutter. So let me show you how it all comes together. This video was taken early in the morning, 5:39 a.m., still pretty dark. It's probably about 30 to 45 minutes before sunrise. I like these reflections in the lake and want to take a photo. I like starting in aperture priority mode at f11 ISO 100. In aperture priority mode, the camera tells you what it thinks is the best shutter speed to provide the perfect amount of light to properly expose the photo. In this case, at f11, the shutter speed is set at 25 seconds. So in low light, like this morning, it's organically already a longer exposure photo. This is the resulting image. So with a shutter speed of 25 seconds, the camera was able to capture the motion in the water and the clouds over that period of time, which smoothed it out and stretched out the clouds. But what if you arrived later, that is closer to sunrise and is already getting brighter? Let me walk through that scenario with you. So this video was taken very close to sunrise. The sun is close to the horizon. Here I did the same thing, aperture priority, f11, ISO 100. But the exposure with more light here is only 1/6 of a second. That's not nearly long enough to get the smooth water and clouds that I'm aiming for in a long exposure. So how do you get a longer exposure when it's getting bright out like this? How do you cut the amount of light entering your camera so that you can keep the shutter open for longer to capture more motion? This is where neutral density filters or ND filters come in. Neutral density filters are key to creating long exposures in brighter light and something I highly recommend to be part of your kit. Most of the long exposures I've shown you tonight, you may recall the ones with the asterisks beside the settings, they were taken using ND filters. So what are they exactly? Well, ND filters are like sunglasses for your camera lens. This is like looking through one half of your pair of sunglasses. Just like how sunglasses block out light coming into your eye, ND filters block light entering your lens and camera. You simply place a filter on the lens. This one is magnetic. They snap right onto the lens with a strong magnetic hold. Super convenient and easy to use. Once it's on the lens, it reduces the amount of light entering the camera, and this lets you leave the shutter open longer without making the image overexposed or too bright, where you lose all the details and the image can look mostly white. This is my kit. I have magnetic round filters, but it also includes a holder for rectangular filters, which I slide in. And this third video shows you a round screw-in filter as another option. But no matter the shape or the type of filter, whether it's round, square, rectangular, magnetic, screw-in, or slide-in, they all do the same thing. They reduce the amount of light entering your lens and your camera. Now, the amount of light they block depends on the filter strength, which is measured in stops. So when you're talking about neutral density filters, you're also talking about the number of stops it has. Think of a stop as a way to measure light. So one stop down reduces the light by half. A two stop reduces that half by another half, so 1/4. That is only 1/4 of the light can go into the camera. Likewise, a three stop further reduces that quarter by another half to bring it to 1/8. That is, a three stop ND filter reduces light by 8 times, or 2 to the power of 3. Now, while this background info may be interesting to some, it's not something you need to remember. So I put together the so what in this quick reference chart of the 3 most common ND filters that I like to use to help you understand which filters are useful in which situations. This is based on the results I like to get. So for example, a ND filter, 3-stop ND filter, the amount of light reduction is by 8 times, 2 to the power of 3. It's great for slight motion blur, such as waterfalls or gentle waves, and that's what I use it for. A 6-stop ND filter reduces light by 64 times. It's great for turning moving water into smooth, silky flow during the day, or for light trails. And then there's a 10-stop, which is my favorite filter. It reduces light by 1,024 times, or 2 to the power of 10. This is great for dramatic long exposures, cloud streaks, misty oceans, emptying a busy street of moving people. Using its 10-stop can get you great dramatic effect. So when I first got my ND filters, I just experimenting, trying different stops at different times of the day to see what they did. Over time, I developed a feel for what I need to get the effect I want. So these are my go-to starting points for common situations that I might find myself. Please feel free to use them as a guide, then adapt based on what you're shooting and for the effect that you want. So the way I approach long exposure photography is that I have an exposure time in mind for the desired effect that I want. And I work towards getting that by adjusting my camera settings with or without filters. So for example, if I want to get the really smooth water and the streaks of clouds that looks like silk, I'm aiming for at least a minute long exposure. If it's car light trails, anywhere between 10 to 30 seconds. Waterfall, I now like between 1 to 5 seconds. Wave trails, 1/4 to 1 second. Street photography, 1/13 to 1/4 of a second. And ICM, 1/15 to 1 second. Okay, so let's pause and recap. We've talked about what long exposure photography is, the gear that you need, camera, tripod, remote, ND filters, and the different artistic effects you can create. Now it's time to just go out and actually shoot. So let me walk you through my process step by step for how to capture a long exposure in various scenarios. For long exposure of clouds and water, let's revisit a scene I showed earlier. I arrived 30-40 minutes before sunrise to set up. This is Humber Bay Park, your favorite spot of mine. I see all the ingredients for a great long exposure. Water, reflection, wispy clouds, beautiful color, perfect conditions. I set the camera to aperture priority, f11, ISO 100, my usual starting point, and let it choose the shutter speed. In this case, it chose 1/6 of a second. Remember that for later. I focus my scene and I take my baseline shot, 1/6 of a second, f11, ISO 100. Now, taken without any filters, this 1/6 of a second exposure, it's okay, but I feel the texture in the water and in the clouds is a bit too strong. It wasn't the emotion I was wanting to convey, because I want that smooth, silky look that I showed earlier. To get that, does anyone remember my go-to time for super smooth and silky water and clouds? Looking at the chat, yes, at least a minute. I know I'm going to need an exposure time of at least a minute. So how do I go from 1/6 of a second to 1 minute? That's a huge time range. I need to be able to cut the amount of light entering my camera so I can keep the shutter open for much longer for that perfect amount of light for a proper exposure using ND filters. You will need ND filters here to get from 1/6 of a second to 1 minute. But which one? From experience, I know I'm going to need around 9 to 10 stops of reduction to get from 1/6 of a second to 1 minute or more. Here I didn't have my 10 stop with me, so I stacked a 3-stop and 6-stop ND filter to get to 9 stops total. Stack just means I put them together, one on top of the other. The effect is additive. 3 plus 6 equals 9. Now I just need to calculate the new shutter speed with the filters on. And this is where your free long exposure calculator app comes in handy. You enter your base shutter speed without filters, which is 1/6 of a second. Choose your ND strength. We use 9 stops. The app will calculate your new shutter speed, 1 minute, 25 seconds. So with filters now, I now need 1 minute and 25 seconds to properly expose the image. So that's why I'm going to need to set my camera. But as you may recall, most cameras max out at 30 seconds. So if you need more than 30 seconds, which we do here, you would need to switch to manual mode and select time or bulb mode. When you're ready to shoot, you press start in your LE app, trigger the remote shutter, wait for the timer to finish, press the remote again, and this is the resulting image. This is the 86-second long exposure. Look how smooth the water and the sky are. This is the vibe I'm always aiming for when I'm doing a long exposure. Calm, peaceful, reflective. To shoot wave trails, I have learned to get wave trails is about watching how the water moves. It's all about timing. The rule of thumb I use is to release a shutter just as the wave recedes back into the ocean to get trails like that. So here, after I focus my scene, I set my shutter speed to 1/3 of a second. I'm using a graduated 3-stop ND filter here, and I want to wait until the wave recedes to the point that this rock becomes visible for my composition. Now. And this is the resulting image. For ICM, we're going to be practicing this during the workshop, but for those who can't make it, here's a quick video of me doing intentional camera movement with waves. I warn you, the movement is very subtle. I dial in my settings, usually between 1/13th and 1/2, depending on the amount of light and the wave speed. I prefer looking through the viewfinder, but you can use your LCD screen as well. And I track the motion of the wave from afar as it crests and it relaxes. And I press the shutter just as the wave crests, but continue the motion through to the release. There is no one way to do this. This is a way that works for me. You just have to experiment and see what works for you. All right, so now that you know how to go about taking a long exposure, before we wrap up, I thought we would go over some common errors that can occur and how to go about troubleshooting them. These are the three that I faced and still do from time to time. First one, photo is blurry even when I'm using a tripod and did everything Michèle told me to do. So even if you used a tripod, you used a remote shutter and manually focused your photos as we learned today, your photo can still come out blurry if there's even the tiniest shake or movement during the exposure, like in this photo, which I took just a few weeks ago. The first thing I did was check my tripod. There are a lot of moving parts on the tripod. Make sure you secure all the knobs. Make sure all the legs are tightened. Everything is still. You can also try lowering the tripod closer to the ground to bring more stability. Also, check for the wind. Wind can shake your camera or tripod, especially if you have camera straps that are dangling from your camera. I tuck them in, wrapping around my tripod, or I remove them. Sometimes I will also wait for the lull in the breeze, if it's just a light breeze, before I take the shot. I also try to avoid shooting near traffic or on bridges or footbridges where vibration from vehicles or from people walking can travel through the ground. Check to make sure you turn off image stabilization if you're using a tripod. If your lens or camera has a feature called image stabilization, which many new lenses and cameras do, turn it off when using a tripod, as it can actually cause blur when nothing is moving. It's really meant for if you're hand holding your camera, there might be a little shake, so that feature helps to stabilize it. 2, my photo is too bright, it's overexposed. This usually means your photo has too much light. That is, your shutter is open for too long or there isn't enough light blocking. The first thing I do is if I use a long exposure calculator, I double check my settings was entered correctly because it's so easy to overswipe. So I check to make sure that there's the right starting shutter speed, that is the shutter speed before filters, and then the correct number of filters that I'm using. Mistakes happen. I, for example, swiped to 7 stops instead of 6 stops. So it ended up being a longer exposure time, which overexposed my image. If there is too much light, just try using a shorter exposure time. If it was 60 seconds in manual mode, try it with 40 seconds or 30 seconds and see how it looks. Alternatively, if you want to use the same exposure time, maybe you want to keep that 60 seconds to get that smooth water, which the 30 seconds won't achieve. Then you can use more ND stops. If you use 3 stops, go to 6 stops. And this is the image after everything was corrected. Lastly, there's just not enough motion effect on my photo. What's happening when that occurs is that your shutter speed may be too short to capture enough movement in the scene. Like in this image here, which I took a few weeks ago. In this case, I would just increase my exposure time. If you are in manual mode and you shot this at 1/15th of a second, maybe increase it to 1 second. If you're in aperture priority, you can also increase the exposure time simply by using a higher f-stop. For example, if you used f11, maybe go to an f14 or f16. This is because the smaller opening means less light coming in, hence you can extend your exposure time. You can also use more ND stops. Maybe if you didn't use filters, add a 3-stop ND at this point in time. Filters will decrease the amount of light coming in. Less light coming in per unit of time means you can keep the shutter open for longer to get the perfect amount of light. Here, I increase the exposure time from 1/25th of a second to 1/3 of a second by changing my f-stop. Okay, so that's all for today. But before we go into questions, I do want to say that I hope you found this session helpful and inspiring. I think now you can understand why long exposure photography is one of my favorite techniques to use. It's such a powerful tool. And as you've seen, it opens up endless creative possibilities and it's a whole lot of fun. So grab your camera and your equipment and go out and shoot. This is my contact information. If you have any questions after today or after you've been out shooting, please feel free to reach out. And for those of you who are attending the workshops, I'll be right there to answer your questions in real time. Lastly, this is my QR code to my Instagram. If you take a long exposure shot inspired by what you learned today, please tag me. I would love to see them. So we have a few minutes to answer some questions. I thought maybe we'll start with the questions that were submitted when you first registered for the webinar. So I looked through the list, and there were 7. First one, do you recommend a mirrorless camera for these types of shots? You don't need a mirrorless camera for long exposures. I've shot many on my DSLR, but it can make things a little bit easier. There's 3 ways which I like. First of all, and I think the biggest benefit for me is that a mirrorless is smaller and lighter, which makes it easier for me to hold in my hand and to carry around. 2, I like the fact that you can preview the image on the LCD and the viewfinder, which makes it very helpful. Being able to see what the sensor sees gives me the ability to adjust my settings accordingly. And lastly, I like the fact that in the mirrorless, it's an electronic shutter. So there's less vibration, which means less chance of any kind of motion blur. What's your go-to lens for landscape? Well, I shoot with a Nikon camera, hence my favorite and my workhorse is my 24 to 120 millimeter f4. And I love using my 20 millimeter f1.8. What are your favorite filters to use when you're photographing a sunset over a body of water? If the sun is in frame, I like to use a graduated neutral density filter, which has a gradient of darkness from one end to the other. This helps balance the light in a situation where you're shooting the sun, as the setting sun on the horizon is really bright, but below the horizon, the foreground is dark. So this type of filter helps to balance the light a bit better. If the sun is not in the sunset shot and I want to smooth out the sky and the body of water, I like the silky smooth look, so I would take out my 6 or 10 stop depending on how bright it still is. If it's sunset, I may start with the 10 stop, but as it would be getting darker and darker, I will likely switch out to my 6 stop. Question 4, what are the recommended filters for long exposure, especially when in daylight? If it's a bright midday sun that you're shooting under, you're going to need at least a 10 stop minimum, probably needing to stack another one on top. For example, I think I've used in under the bright sun 16 stops, a 10 stop and a 6 stop. Which ND filter would you suggest for a beginner trying long exposure photography? All great questions. For this one, I have 2 in mind, but there are pros and cons of each. But I think I would say for an absolute beginner, a person who hasn't shot a long exposure at all, I would start with a 6 stop ND filter. There is enough light reduction to allow for a long exposure because it probably will allow for a 5 to 30 seconds exposure in golden hour or a cloudy daytime shoot without being too dark. It's also easy to compose your shot as it is not that dark, so, to prevent you from seeing your scene when the filter is on your lens. It's great for waterfalls, for waves, clouds, and smoothing water effect. It also works well without needing extra gear, like the long exposure calculator app. But the next step would be going to a 10 stop, which is much better for midday shooting because it allows for exposure times of 30 seconds or more. It does require a little bit more planning. It's pretty dark, so once it's on your lens, it's hard to compose or to focus. So you're going to need to pre-compose, and as well as you're going to need to calculate the exposure using the LE calculator, and you probably would need to use a remote because the exposure time would be greater than 30 seconds. So it really depends on what level you are, but those would be my two filters that I would get. ND filters can be expensive, especially for longer than 10 stops. How do you minimize cost? Question is when you need more than 10 stops, you would need to stack another ND filter on top, which means buying more filters, which can add up costs. So if you only have a 10 stop and you need a longer exposure time for the effect that you want, for example, let's say you're shooting a bright light, this is what I would do. Number one, make sure you're shooting at your lowest ISO. Whatever your native ISO is for your camera is usually ISO 100. Two, you can also increase your f-stop like using a higher number. For example, if you are at f11, maybe go up to f14, f16, or even f18, because the smaller aperture would mean less light coming in per unit of time, which means that you can keep the shutter open for a little bit longer. Lastly, although it may not be an option if you are already out there shooting, you can also wait until it's not as bright. Maybe come back at golden hour or at dusk when it's less bright. Hence, the 10 stop may be enough then for the effect that you want. What led you into this type of photography? Well, I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder anxiety back in 2018. And as I worked towards my mental wellness, I found that photography was a huge help. Long exposures particularly felt like a kind of intentional slowness, forcing me to slow down, focus on composition, watching the light, and shift my attention away from the stress, as well as clearing my head. Because if you've ever experienced anxiety, there's lots of thoughts just banging around inside your brain. And when you're able to focus on one particular thing, especially if it's detailed, that helps to relax your mind. There's just something really grounding and therapeutic about long exposure photography. And that's why I tend to aim for long exposure shots that capture that calm, peaceful vibe of how I felt being in that moment. And that's it for this evening. Before I sign off, I want to thank T. Shots and Mike Simpson for co-hosting and inviting me to present. Thank you all for coming and for your great questions. And for those attending the workshop, we will send out the location and coordinates via email the day before. And lastly, to keep improving future sessions, I would be incredibly grateful if you could all take 2 to 3 minutes to share your thoughts on a short feedback form, which I will send out at the end of this presentation to your email. Your input really means a lot. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your evening.